Hello, this is our first online lecture. We're going to begin with Chapter 17, Patterns of Inheritance. And this is going to be a conversation about genetics, and it's also known as classical genetics, as well as Mendelian genetics, because it has as its creator someone named Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel lived in the mid-1800s, and he helped us to understand how genetics works. In my discussion later, I'm going to show you that he worked with pea plants, and the reason that I call him a lucky monk here is because he happened to pick traits that were very specifically one color or another, one feature or another, and not all traits work that way. But before we get into describing all of that, I do want to say that he was unlucky in the fact that his work went largely unnoticed and even lost for decades and was not uncovered again until the early 1900s. And so sadly, our understanding of genetics was postponed for 40 or 50 years. But where is it today? I want to jump over here to a site. This is a company called Spark Therapeutics. It's based out of Philadelphia. And Spark Therapeutics would not be able to do what they do if it were not for what foundation was laid for us by Gregor Mendel. Their product is something called Luxturna. And this is a form of gene therapy. It was the first FDA-approved gene therapy, and it actually cures blindness. They were able to do this by delivering a good version of the gene that the patients had a mutated version of. And if we didn't understand different versions of genes and how they played a role inside individuals' cells inside their bodies, if we didn't understand what Mendel taught us, then we would never be able to be here in 2020. And this drug was just approved last year, I believe. So let's come back over to our PowerPoint presentation and just define a few more terms and explain what Mendel did. So he happened to work with pea plants, and in a plant, and this is something that we had discussed before, plants have both female parts and male parts. So the stigma here is the female part, and this is where the seed will eventually be fertilized, or the egg will be fertilized. And then these are the male portions, the stamen. Well, what he did was he would take two different plants and he would cross-fertilize them. He wouldn't let them self-fertilize. So he would take some of the pollen, which is just sperm, from the stamens of one plant, and then he would deliver it over to the stigma where the eggs are down here of another plant. And so through this cross-fertilization, he could determine which traits would show up when and which genes were dominating over other genes. Now let's take a look at a few other terms. We can, maybe we cannot. Now imagine that in the 1800s, when Mendel was working on what became known as genetics, he didn't even understand what DNA was. He didn't understand that inside each of our cells, as we talked about, that we have two versions of each chromosome. One came from our mother, one came from our father. But he did piece all these things together by looking at not what was inside the cell, which we can now see and test for, but he looked at what was outside, what we call the phenotype. So genes make proteins. Your genotype are the gene versions that you have. but your phenotype is what we see on the outside, how those genes compete with each other and manifest themselves on the outside. So that's the difference between genotype and phenotype.